I'm sorry, does someone start this or do I just launch into it?
I think Margaret is administering Zoom, so we can just launch into it.
Okay. So should I start?
Sure. I think it's 12:01.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to today's version of Brown Bag. And I'm going to just take a few minutes and go through what we call the discretionary policy, just to give you an idea of some things that we make easier, hopefully, that we're allowed to. So I'm going to go through about 5 or 6 slides, and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. Okay, what is the discretionary policy? So for federally funded research or research that is under the jurisdiction of the FDA or the Department of Justice, the IRB has to follow certain rules. So in other words, if they're federally funded and under those two or under those 2 organizations, we have to follow the federal rules. When the study is not funded or under the auspices of FDA and DOJ, then we can allow some flexibility under certain circumstances. And so I'm going to go through those with you. So for continuing review, what we do is, as you should know by now, with the common rule change in 2018, expedited studies do not have continuing review anymore. Tissue banks fall under typically, not always, but typically under expedited review. However, we approve them with a 3-year continuing review and not with no continuing review. And the reason is that when you close a bank, you have to close the bank correctly. And there's a guideline on our Investigator Guidelines that walks you through how to close a tissue bank, not a data bank, but a tissue bank. And so we put a 3-year continuing review on them so they'll come back and they won't just evaporate, which is what happens basically with other expedited studies. The other item is that if we're the reviewing IRB for an expedited study, then we require a continuing review, even though the federal regs do not. And the reason that is because if we're the reviewing IRB, that means you as the investigator are running a protocol that's at different sites. We just want to have a little bit more oversight on what's going on because we're the IRB for all those sites. And so we just don't want it to go on forever without us knowing and sort of forcing you to keep track of what's going on in these other sites.
And it really helps to ensure that all the sites are properly closed before the study is actually closed here at UF, because since we are the reviewing IRB for everyone, if an investigator, for example, wants to close the study, we don't want sites to think that there is still IRB oversight. So it's an additional.
Okay. Now, there are other certain circumstances that I'll go through. So you may like this. For exempt research, regardless of the funding, the investigator or the coordinator only has to include in the submission to us the key personnel. So the PI, the co-investigators, the study coordinator on the study. So you don't need to put all the students or all the other miscellaneous folks that may be involved in that exempt research, just what are considered the key personnel as defined. And so it's then the responsibility of the PI or you as the coordinator to account for any training, qualifications, or for all other study personnel. Because since you're not listing them into my IRB, the software isn't keeping track for you. So then, as far as changes go, only changes to key personnel need IRB approval, again, for these exempt protocols. Okay. I'm going to tell you briefly about correspondence students. That doesn't affect most of you. So I'm going to go over at a 30,000-foot level. If you have a question, call us. But so if you have a correspondence student, which is defined as a non-local student enrolled in a UF-run distance learning class or program, and they're submitting a research protocol as a means to complete that UF program, but they don't list a UF faculty member as the PI of the research. So in other words, they're doing it in DeLand, and they're doing a study in DeLand. The PI of the study is a pharmacist or a nurse or somebody in DeLand, then they don't need to submit that to the UF IRB. And as I mentioned, I can explain it more fully to those who it affects. So if that is something that affects you and you don't understand what I just said, then give me a call. Let's see, other rules. We recently started a new concept called an open access databanks. So open access databanks are a select group of de-identified databases that are under the jurisdiction of the UF honest brokers. So Chris Harley and his group. And so basically what happens is they submit those to us. We approve them as totally de-identified. And if subsequent research that somebody else may submit only uses information from these open access databases, then they don't require any IRB approval. So again, this is spelled out more in the Investigator Guidelines on our website. And if you're on this call and you've never seen our Investigator Guidelines, please go to them because they will answer a lot of questions for you. But this is spelled out more and it defines which are the open access databases that exist. But this is much easier. So if you had a student or somebody who wants to do a project and they can use that database, then they don't have to submit that protocol to anybody. I think this is the last one, but for UF studies that we submit to WIRB, which is now called WCG because it morphed into, it was purchased by someone else. So if you're submitting a study to WIRB, per our agreement, there are two things that in the new common rule are required you don't need to do to WIRB because they're not federally funded typically, they're industry funded. You don't need to include the key information presented at the beginning of the consent form, which is usually under section 5, where you have 5 A, B, C, D, E, and you have a summary of the protocol. You don't have to do that in these submissions. And there's a template language typically in section 7 regarding the use of de-identified data and or specimens for future research. That template information isn't required. Ivana, you want to comment on that? No.
Yeah, sure. So this is actually, let me place this in a broader context of a recent change that we have implemented with respect to the informed consent process for work studies that are on the industry track. We have allowed, effective November 1st, 2021, that investigators can use either sponsors template or work template instead of approved template from UF that was in place for many years. And so that was a huge efficiency that we built into the work process. However, there was a small challenge. Many sponsors, since of course they don't have federal funds, they didn't feel compelled to comply with the new requirements for the informed consent. So their templates didn't have analogs of section 5 and 7 in their templates. However, our institutional policy applies our FWA across the board. And with this exception, we would allow you to use sponsored templates and work templates even more efficiently without the need to insert this type of language as an addition. So that will be effective immediately, and I will let Worb know as soon as we're done with this talk, so you can benefit from this small improvement in the process.
Okay, so I think that's it. Pretty quick. I will stop sharing and see if there are any questions about what I just presented. And if not, I think for some reason it muted me again. So I'm going to just see if there's any questions about what I just presented. If not, I think it was broadcast to you guys that if you had any other question, then this will be a free game. You can ask Ivana and I anything IRB related. Let's see, there's a chat. I missed first 2 minutes. Any change in data banks? Well, I'd have to just to not go over it again. You can, if you want to touch base with the IRB afterwards, you could do that.
This brown bag, like every other one, I think the host just muted us accidentally. So this brown bag, like every other one, is actually recorded, and the recordings are posted on our website so that you guys can listen. But we have mentioned open access data banks as they relate to the requirement to seek IRB's approval for a non-human study. So that's more of the same. It's not a change. We have just reiterated that in the policy because it was one of the known exceptions to our institutional policy that requires application of our FWA to all types of research, regardless of funding.
Any questions about anything IRB related? Let's see, declare if a visiting student are doing research here, we don't need IRB approval. No, it's visiting, it's students that are doing are in a UF program, but they're not doing the research here.
Amy, this mostly affects DMP students and various nursing students. They have a course, a remote learning opportunity for them. So these students are actually working at some institution outside of UF, but they're our students. And so in order to complete a degree, they need to do a project. And so that was really the target of that discussion.
Okay, if you have a med student from UCF that is at UF and they're involved in a research project, that may be a problem. Because there is no agreement to allow that to occur. They only come here to, they have an agreement to be involved in clinical care, but not in research.
Feel free to unmute yourself, Amy, and we can have a live conversation. It's actually maybe even more efficient to do it that way if you.
Yeah, in this case, we did have a separate agreement. They were here clinically, but they were also here on a research agreement. So we did have those things in place through the College of Medicine for them to be able to do that. And that's why I just.
So Amy, that's an interesting concept because somebody may be permitted to do research at UF, but it's still a further question under which IRB's oversight they are, because the UCF would be their IRB. So permission to do research doesn't entail necessarily that we would be their IRB of record for their activities here. It could be, but their institution would cede review to us for their activities. That would be the common scenario. How is that?
I mean, basically, the College of Medicine wouldn't have that authority to do that.
Well, in the past, and I'm using this as a specific example because this took place, is that the PI on record was the UF, and that person was doing research here, and we had to upload copies of the research agreement to the IRB, and you did approve it. So we had those agreements and you guys reviewed them and said, yes, then they can participate.
It was an Office of Research signed agreement?
I have to go back and look specifically, but I believe it was through the College of Medicine because that's where their clinical research agreement, I believe.
Let's connect offline to get to the bottom of it. We'll be happy to help in the review.
Well, that project, again, I mean, it's already been approved. I'm just trying to get through the understanding that in this case, again, that UF IRB would still be, that we still need IRB approval for that project.
So look,
am I understanding that correctly?
Your case is actually not the intended target of the discretionary policy.
Okay.
As I said, the discretionary policy targets, typically this is typical for DMP students who are basically just affiliated with UF only because they're a student, correspondence student of UF, but they work, for example, at, High Springs local community healthcare center or someplace like that, right? And so in order to complete their degree, they need to complete the project. And so that's really the target audience.
Okay.
To get clear on agreements, research agreements need to be signed by the institutional official, who is Dr. Norton, or his designee, who is Michael Mahoney. Mm-hmm. And that's the proper channel for routing research agreements that deal either with the permission to do research at an institution or that deal with the reliance matters, such as which IRB is going to be the reviewing IRB for a study and for the personnel that's involved in the study. So, but that's a completely separate topic, completely outside of the scope of this conversation. And we'll be happy again to connect over this just to make sure that everything is in place for this particular study that needs to be in place.
Okay.
Thank you.
I review a lot of protocols and I see a lot of issues. So there's got to be questions out there.
Yeah, so if there are no questions about the discretionary policy per se, which is pretty simple and straightforward, we wanted to kind of have a conversation with you guys, basically like an IRB panel, whatever question, IRB related question you might have, we'll be happy to answer.
So this is sort of connected. We have a data bank. And so can you, and it has identifiers. Can you imagine an arm, let's call it, that is an open access database or data bank where the separate arm is de-identified, but kind of the master data is coming from the original data bank that does have identifiers. And then that allows us to expand our reach so that we can offer it to people who don't need to know the identifiers, but we also have our original data bank that's kind of for internal use where it's okay to share identifiers such that people can look up things in the chart and things like that.
Sure. So let me explain the open access databases more thoroughly, and then maybe that'll answer your question. So the two that we've approved are under the oversight of the official honest brokers for the institution. There's about 7 of them. And those people, that's their job, that's part of their job description, and they actually sign an agreement that indicates that if they were to disclose information that they shouldn't, they would be fired. They'd lose their job. And so, and they're trained to all of what encompasses being an honest broker. And so what they have done is they have extracted information from the integrated data repository, which is basically all the data in UF and CHANS, everything. And they extract certain data and they put it in a location that's totally de-identified, but linked, but only the honest brokers can link that. And so they submit those to us and we approve that basically, and we check to make sure what's in that database is that everything in the database is totally HIPAA de-identified. And so then going forward, again, they make that then available. And then other people can then access that free of charge, free of IRB approval. What you described is sort of an offshoot of something you already have, but you don't have the infrastructure to the honest broker infrastructure that the integrated data repository staff does. Does that help?
That is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Now, ideally, we would have a lot of these. And, you know, if we could get a lot of particularly student research done off of these open access databases, that would save the IRB a lot of time. That would save maybe you guys a lot of time who may have to help students submit things. So, you know, we just started this not too long ago, and but it's a concept that I've been working on for probably 15 years. It's just not always that easy to do.
Thank you.
Yep. Is there a list of these databases that we could use? Okay, so what I'm going to do is, let's see. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to access something.
And while we're looking for that, I'm going to make a small announcement. We will be reaching out to some of you guys for usability testing of our new website. Our website, as you might remember, is a place where you can find valuable information. And I think investigator guidelines are, so this particular question is answered best by looking at the investigator guideline that lists specifically with what open access data banks are and which ones are currently approved at UF.
Yeah.
So stay on the lookout for an email. We'll invite a few or maybe even up to a dozen of research coordinators to navigate our new website and give us some feedback about its usability.
So let me share this, and even tell me if the sharing, does it stay when I, so this is our IRB website. If you go down here to IRB policies, guidances, and guidelines and guidances, when I hit that, does it change it?
Yes, we see.
Okay, so now you have IRB policies, our investigator guidelines, and regulatory guidances. You don't really need to look at the policies or the guidances, but if you click on investigator guidelines, you have basically a index of all sorts of topics. Okay. And if you go down to open access databases, does it show it?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to have you read it here, but this will then describe what I just said and will include the open access databases that exist. And so I can tell you when
if you scroll down just to show where they're listed, which ones are currently approved.
I don't know what you're saying.
Yes, so question 2, which ones are currently approved?
Yeah, so, but my point here is that, you know, oftentimes when you ask us questions, particularly when I get asked questions, the first thing I'll end up doing is referring you to the Investigator Guideline on that topic, because it's in a question and answer format. Like I get questions all the time about case reports or quality versus research or all those other things. That's why we created these. They should be helpful to you and answer a lot of questions instead of either you guessing or you're trying to get a hold of us to answer the question. So I'm gonna, since in case, let me just get our staff to think about maybe some questions that are some things you want either Ivana and I to clarify that you see happen a lot. For example, I'll give you the first one. When you want to revise a consent form in the IRB software, one of the things we see that people don't do correctly, and part of it is a problem with the software because it lets you do it, is that if you're going to revise a current consent form, they're basically, you unfortunately have two paths. One is you can revise the one you have and basically lay it on top of the one that exists, or you can add another one, which really isn't a new consent form. It's a revision of the existing consent form. So then what ends up happening in the submission is you have, instead of having consent forms on top of each other as they get revised, you have like a list of a whole bunch of consent forms, some of which are no longer active. And so, okay, Allison, Allison put in the chat instructions for updating a consent form. So I just, you know, again, and we may think of ways to prevent you from doing this, but a lot of people do it. So if a lot of people are doing it wrong, there's got to be something on our end that we can fix. But just as an FYI, if you don't know how to do that, call the office, or I guess look at those instructions. No, everybody knows everything out there. Anything from anybody?
Any submission issues, clarificatory questions?
May I ask another weird question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So our team, let's say our faculty, would like to be able to see the data in the data bank.
Okay.
Not necessarily to acquire it, is the way they would put it, but to be able to see it, so that they have a better idea of what's going on. What do you think are some good methods for that without actually giving it to them?
Methods. Well, you know, there's got to, obviously, if you have some kind of view only way of looking at it, that would be one way. But what are they trying to accomplish? I mean, in other words, are they folks that are on that protocol, or are they people that aren't involved in the database but want to see what's in there to see, I guess, to help them design a protocol or something?
That's a really good question. It probably is trying to generate hypotheses for future projects. This is the data bank that's been around forever. before data banks were a thing. So we have all kinds of people on our, almost all of the faculty is on our protocol, and we don't really need that for the way data banks work. But back in the day, before data banks, they had to be
Okay,
on.
now I've almost been here. Well, I have been here longer than data banks have.
Right.
And the first data bank,
This is movement disorders data bank.
okay, the first data bank was actually the brain bank.
Right.
And so they've been a thing for quite some time. So when you submit a bank, we ask you to give us the data points in the bank.
Yes, sir.
And so you could certainly provide those data banks to a potential researcher so that they can see what types of information is there without seeing the information.
Right. I have a data dictionary.
Okay.
Relatively complete.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess, I mean, if you can ascertain from them what they're trying to accomplish, I mean, there's usually ways to accomplish most things. And sometimes when people ask me questions, I'll give them an answer that is surprising because it's easier than what they thought. So if there is someone that, or if you want to talk offline later about a specific example, maybe we can figure out how that can be accomplished.
Okay, thank you.
So here is from Ali Trainer. So she says, I get questions often regarding data sets. Here it is, that are limited versus de-identified, and when using a patient ID, subject ID, is it still de-identified or not? So it's a question about coded versus de-identified.
Yeah, and it's a good question because, you know, when you submit stuff to us, if you say it's de-identified, then what, if that's all you tell us, then what we're interpreting from that is that no one anywhere can re-identify it. But oftentimes what you really mean is that the information is placed in a location that only has a code, and that the identifiers are somewhere else, but it can be linked back to the individual. So de-identified can be de-identified or de-identified with a code. And the code then makes, it depends then on who has access to that de-identified data set with a code as to whether or not we would consider it de-identified or not. Now it's a little bit of a double talk, but
well, I think that double talk is necessary because OHRP and HIPAA have different notions of what it means to be de-identified. And so we have to start, when you apply multiple regulatory frameworks, it's tricky. And so we have to go with the most stringent one, especially because when we are talking about de-identified in OHRP sense, they say, yes, if you have a code, you can still be considered de-identified provided there is a confidentiality agreement. So we have to be very crystal clear on which one is which. And so sometimes that comes as an irritation to the research community, but it's asked for a reason. And the reason is that we are juggling the two regulatory definitions. I hope that helps demystify the queries.
there's got to be something up there. I was going to share another thing. As we're, okay, I'm going to, is there any other questions? Okay, let me share another thing that you may all not be aware of. So ancillary reviews. I'll try to make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. So, you know, when you submit something to the IRB does its part, but then there are a lot of other groups within the university that have to do their part. And some of them have nothing to do with the IRB, but they all come through the IRB, or the IRB is the one that holds your feet to the fire that you're complying with someone else's rules. So if you look at what ancillaries exist, so there's there are some ancillaries that are approved prior to initiating the IRB approval. So in other words, conflict of interest. If there's a if the university might have a conflict of interest, then that has to be determined first and before the IRB can even look at the protocol, because there may be such a conflict that we won't allow the local IRB to do it. SRMC, the Scientific Review and Monitoring Committee, for all NCI, all cancer-related and peripheral cancer-related studies, those have to go through SRMC before we even look at them. Same thing with the Institutional Biosafety Committee for all gene therapy studies. Even though this has waned as far as protocols, any inpatient COVID-related studies here have to go through the COVID committee again before the IRB will look at. All right, and then there's a whole bunch of other, I'm going to scroll down, you'll see them. There's a whole bunch of other ancillaries that occur at the same time the IRB approval is being done. So that's this list here. So HERC for radiation, OCR is doing their thing regarding the billing and contracting. EH&S, if you're collecting certain specimens and moving them around. Conflict of interest, if it's an investigator conflict, not an institutional conflict. IRB authorization, if we're ceding the protocol to another group. Clinicaltrials.gov, privacy office, if there's any issue there. External reviews. So, we have protocols, and you will probably be involved in more as we go, but, we have a lot of external sites now. Halifax, Sacred Heart, there's a plethora of those in Jacksonville. The villages will soon be on board. Scripps may be on board at some point. And so some of those locations like Halifax Hospital, for example, they have their own what do they call it? IRB oversight committee or something like that, research committee. And it's basically Halifax wants to bless doing a study before our faculty who are at Halifax can do the study. And before the IRB here, us, review the study. So there are external reviews. If it's an international study, there's an ancillary for that. CTSI has to approve things that CTSI govern, like REDCap. And I guess I have the privacy office on here twice. No, I guess, yeah, I do have it on here twice by mistake. Okay, so again, the reason I'm sharing that with you is that there are a lot of things that folks think are IRB issues that are not IRB issues. But, the way this thing originally was planned was that you submitted things once to the IRB, and then we would be the center of spokes, and EH&S or conflict of interest or whatever would all come off of that. And frankly, the thought was that there would only be one submission, which now has changed. But there are a lot of things like social media. Where you can advertise on social media is not an IRB issue. Recruitment policies, like cold calling, or not being allowed to cold call, or not being allowed to have opt-outs. Those are institutional policies. They're not IRB policies, but we enforce them. So I'm telling you all this because there's a lot of misperceptions out there that of what the IRB is and what it isn't. So we're trying to, frankly, disentangle the IRB from all these other external sites or external groups.
So to answer Alice's question, so if there is a pending ancillary and the study is back to the investigator, saying submit when the ancillary review is submitted, what do I do? Do I call the IRB or do I call the ancillary? So to get things moving, you'll be best advised to call the relevant ancillary office to clarify with them what's holding up the review. Of course, if you call us, we'll be happy to help you and to connect you with them. But the most efficient way would be to call the relevant office. We have implemented something in my IRB that you may or may have noticed since last month. Whenever there is a completed ancillary review, we send a notification to the study team that says there has been a submitted ancillary review for your study, so that you're at least notified that the ancillary review is submitted. So if that's the only pending thing awaiting for us to issue approval, that way you know to go in and to submit it back to us. Next question, if any. Any questions regarding reliances or seeding review to an external IRB or collaborative research in general?
Can you please define a reliance?
Sure. Reliance is a two-place relation between two institutions where one institution relies on another institution's IRB for approval and regulatory oversight of the study. And so we have a seeding institution that relies on an external IRB that belongs to another institution or is an independent commercial IRB for the regulatory oversight of the study. And so per federal rules, whenever there is a reliance, it has to be documented. There are many ways to document reliance. The most common way is by virtue of an IRB authorization agreement or a memorandum of understanding. For your information, University of Florida is a participant institution on the SMART master agreement, which we predominantly use for all our reliances, unless there is an IRB record that uses a different agreement. We do have our own institutional master agreement that we could offer to institutions that are unwilling to sign on to SMART agreement. So there is some flexibility there as well, but SMART is the agreement of choice. And so what that does is really cuts down on the time that's needed to negotiate reliance agreements with institutions, because the general counsel is out of the picture. This is one agreement that has been vetted and accepted by now probably 900 institutions in the country.
Now, I don't know if you're all sleeping out there, eating out there, or multitasking and really not listening. If there's anything, really, you have the opportunity here, or we can just, let you go and go on to other things, and that's fine too.
Peter, this is CJ from the Department of Occupational Therapy. So from the conversations we have, I do have one question related to the reliance, and the other question is not related to today's presentation topic about discretionary policy. I hope that is okay. So yeah. For the reliance, I may have an upcoming federal trial that are going to work with the Brooks Rehab, who I believe they are not affiliated with the UF, so is using them as a clinical site. So for that study, project, do you consider them as a reliance?
Go ahead, Ivana.
Yeah, so just to clarify, what kind of a site is it?
Brooks.
Oh, Brooks Rehab. Oh, Brooks Rehab is, we do have a reliance agreement with them.
Oh, okay.
And they're reviewing IRB, so they would be relying on us. That's really one of the oldest agreements we have.
Oh, cool.
In fact, that's a little bit of an outlier because Brooks staff would be added to my IRB as study staff, and so you would follow the normal.
You just froze. But so yeah, there are certain relationships that are pretty tight around here, like UF and Shands. So Shands Hospital doesn't have an IRB. They rely on the UF IRB as their IRB. So, but that's So that Reliance is under a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, that has been in place for 25, 30 years. Same, there's one such thing with Brooks. There will soon be one with Halifax. We do have one with Sacred Heart and the Panhandle. We will have one at some point with the Villages. Baptist Hospital in Jacksonville. There's probably others I'm forgetting.
And so this is an interesting situation because these studies are actually not, although there is a Reliance agreement that's needed in the background, these are not actually single IRB studies, because this is typically a situation where our faculty and staff cross over to another legal entity such as Brooks to do research there.
Okay.
Single IRB studies as flagged in our system are typically studies that involve several institutions where there is no crossover of faculty and staff from one institution to another, but everybody is doing the same protocol or some aspect of the protocol, but at their home institution. And then there's just one IRB that reviews it. Brooks is slightly different, and these satellite locations that Peter was describing are slightly different is because our faculty and staff actually do have a dual appointment there. And so we are their IRB, and of course, to be somebody's IRB, you have to have a Reliance agreement, but this is not a traditional single IRB review. Reliance, as designed and described by NIH in their policy in 2018 and then later in common rule. But nonetheless, Reliance agreement is required. But you don't have to worry about the details. I just wanted to kind of clarify the distinction between sites and locations. This would be for us a location where UF conducts research because we send our faculty there to do something.
So this is probably, I don't know if it's to the detail of the question now, because I'm working with them, and under Brook, they have a different system, outpatient, inpatient. And so it doesn't matter which section I'm working with them. It's just under the umbrella with the Brooks Reliance.
So long as it's within the scope of the FWA that's on the Reliance agreement. If that's one FWA, namely one legal entity, typically FWAs go with a legal entity, then that will be okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
so go
typically,
ahead.
yes. I was just going to say typically, yes.
Okay. And my second question is related to, so under this Reliance, if I want to add their, clinical staff into the IRB as a research staff, I assume they still need to get UFID, all the things, the loop they have to jump through.
Yes. If you call our office, we can give you the phone number that gives you a UFID in a matter of minutes, and then that sets up a code that you need to set up the Gator link to register in My IRB. It's very simple.
And then they have to go through the training and register the IRB. Okay.
Yes, which is probably 5 to 10 minutes. Training is 20 to 30 minutes, and registration is probably 5 minutes because it's all taking data from the UF HR system.
But
So
if it involves Brooks, if it was really a single IRB study, then like if we were doing it with Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt would be responsible for making sure their folks are trained however Vanderbilt wants them trained. They wouldn't have to follow our training.
correct.
Okay, so there's a difference between what, like Ivana said, between a true single IRB concept and a concept where Halifax or Brooks or Baptist, or a slightly different example, is simply a research site for a UF faculty person. So UF faculty are actually practicing at Baptist, at Sacred Heart, at Halifax. And we have an agreement with them that those institutions to review protocols for our faculty that are doing research at their place.
Okay.
That's why when you're doing this stuff, I know it's complicated, and is you got to ask first. Don't just, if you're doing something like that, don't just submit it. A lot of people have a tendency to just try to submit it, and the mindset is the IRB will just straighten it out for me. That's not a good concept. Better concept is if you really don't know what you're doing, call us first. because it'll save you time, save us a ton of time. And everybody will have a better, a better experience
Mhm.
if
Yep.
we know ahead of time and point you in the right direction.
Sure. So Peter, I think I would like to set an appointment with you to discuss the study design I have. I'm conducting one implementation study. So there are some issues. It's similar like a clinical trial, but sometimes the clinical procedure need to be adaptable to the clinical setting. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around and really need some input.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep. I mean, I do that all the time. So just send me an email or whatever. We'll find a time and we'll have a Zoom call. And I'll probably have one of the IRB staff with me so that when you submit it, they see it first. They know what we talked about, and hopefully that translates into the submission.
Sure, sure. I will lay out those in the emails too. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, I can be the IRB staff who sits in. Good for you. Any other questions? Trying to think what other people, what we see a lot of. I can share this other thing here. So this is current state of research recruitment requirements at the University of Florida. First one, patient referrals. A clinical practitioner may not refer a patient to a researcher for potential inclusion into a research study without the prior written or at least verbal approval of the patient. So in other words, if I'm a doc, I have a patient and I know you have a study that my patient may be a good candidate for, I have to ask my patient first if they're interested in hearing about it. I can't just go to you and say, hey, call my patient up. I think they're a good candidate. And now the patient gets a call from somebody they don't have a clue who they are. Cold calling is kind of the same, a little bit of the same thing. Is basically in order to approach a subject who is typically a patient of some kind, there has to be what's known as a warm handoff. In other words, somebody who's contacting that patient, the patient there has to be some clinical relationship before there can be a research relationship. And that's not, it has to be in the ballpark. The other, where it's allowable also is if someone has signed consent to share. So which people are offered that on almost all the clinic visits. And you either agree or not to be recontacted if you might fit a study criteria. Opting out, that's not allowed here. Opting out is when I send you a letter and it says, I'm going to call you and pitch a study to you unless you call me first and tell me you don't want to hear about it. That's opting out. In other words, I'm forcing you to do something to avoid getting a call from me. And again, these are things that are not IRB issues. It's the IRB enforces the issue. Social media, I mentioned, actually that policy has just changed. The institution now basically allows you to post on most social media platforms. But there is a policy on that that you can go look at. Consent to share, I mentioned. Chart review studies, it's kind of the same thing. If you're submitting a chart review study, then we have to know that there is some reason for you to have access to those charts or whoever's doing the protocol. Because if nothing else, you may have a student who's looking at your chart or a neighbor whose kid is looking at your chart. There's reasons for for the whole cold calling issue. And it's been recently supported again by, well, by certainly Dr. Nelson and others in a hierarchy of the university. There's a few things here, let's see. If a subject has consented to a contact registry, that would not be a cold call. Yeah, the subsequent thing would not be a cold call. Right, just thought it could be mentioned. Okay, well, yeah, sure. I mean, the whole point of having a contact registry is if people agree to be contacted, have at it. You know, once the person themselves gives you permission, that's the best thing. Because if you ask us to give you permission, we can't really speak for the subject. And so the regulations are much more restrictive. So it's much easier to ask people and have them tell you it's okay. Well, I know I don't know how long this lasts, but it doesn't look like we're getting a ton of questions. As always, if you have a question, my advice to you would be first go to the Investigator Guidelines and see if the topic is already there. And then if not, then call the office. And it's much better to ask before you submit. It will save you time and it'll save us time. And everybody has a better experience. Anything else? Or I'm killing time at this point. Are we good? I don't know who runs these, Ivana.
Lauren does, and Margaret is filling in for her today.
Okay, so Margaret, anything you need to say from the brown bag world?
Thank you for coming, and we appreciate seeing you all. It was a good turnout.
Do we have a coming attractions, or is that those just come out?
They'll come out of the newsletter and further communications, but do reach out to us. Would like to hear from you. What are your questions? And you know, you can always call the IRB office or send an email to the irb@ufl.edu, where you would get a response within a few business hours. And do let us know how we can help.
Yeah, I mean, if you have topics for future brown bags, certainly let us know, because you know this is obviously for you guys. And you know, if we find things, like I said, with the consent forms that are typically done incorrectly, again, it's on us to make sure we do a better job of explaining it, or do a better job of educating folks. All right.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.